I'm just turning this recording on. All right. So, hey, how's it going? 2 bottles of wine.
So this is the only one I found that looked like that.
All right. So we'll start off with. I'm not sure who else is here on the Zoom, but we'll do just a sort of brief reminder of what we covered the last 2 weeks, because it'll play into this week. Even though each class I'll try to make stand on its own, but the context is helpful. So, the first week we talked about what are the goals of Judaism, like what's the whole point of this system, civilization, religion, people, whatever you want to call it, and we basically divided it into 2 primary categories. We talked about collectivist goals, making a better world for everyone, etc., however you want to look at it, but a goal that's outside of the individual, something for the betterment of society or the world. And then we talked about individualistic goals. No, I don't say that in a negative way, but self-perfection, whether it's intellectual, spiritual, etc. And we gave examples of both. Last week we divided sort of the way we understand how Judaism achieves these goals into 2 sort of broad camps. One camp was a rationalist camp, where we basically said, okay, it achieves these goals through methods we can understand. For example, we talked about Eliezer Berkovitz, kashrut, as a tool that trains you to not always fulfill your desires, whatever it is, but ultimately it's a training towards sort of being used to submitting yourself to interests that are not your own. We saw, for example, kashrut is almost models of sort of enhancing or respecting life. And then that's the one camp was sort of seeing the tradition as rationalist, and the way it works is really a rational method. And then we saw mystical approaches that told sort of grander narratives about the way in which mitzvot, or doing sort of religious acts, impact the cosmos, or impact something in the heavens that makes the world better or perfects you, etc., but based on some sort of spiritual metaphysics that isn't necessarily rational. Everyone we looked at in the last 2 weeks, though, tried to give an argument for understanding a reason or a goal or purpose to what we're doing in Jewish life. What I want to look at today are a series of thinkers who say that we should not be looking for reasons for what we're doing at all. And that whole philosophical attempt, that whole movement towards trying to find reasons, explanations, justifications, whether they're rational or mystical, social or individual, that all of that is sort of misguided, and we should just be doing the religious acts, living a religious life, period, and just end it there. And we're going to look at 4 different models or approaches for this argument. So with that, we'll turn, if we take the source sheet, the first source we'll look at is from the Babylonian Talmud, and in the spirit of what we've been doing the last 2 weeks, for each source I'll give, to the extent I recall, I'll give sort of a little bit of background. So the Talmud we talked about, but as a reminder, the Talmud is composed of 2 portions, primarily. One is the Mishnah, which are the Tannaitic teachings, which basically are the teachings, sort of summary, largely legal, but summary teachings from the time of around the destruction of the Second Temple, a bit before, so call it 200 BC till around 300 or 400 CE. I might be getting those years off by 100 years or so forgive me, I don't recall. And then the second part of the Talmud are the Amoraim. These are the commentators on the Mishnah. That's what we call the Gemara. So the Talmud is Mishnah, and then the commentary on it is the Gemara, and that extends until the Talmud closes, let's say, somewhere between 600 and 800 CE. The Talmud is the primary corpus that sort of sets out Jewish law, and also a lot of these sort of parables and traditions and philosophies. It's not a unitary text. There's lots of different positions within it, but it's sort of maybe the last text after the Bible that sort of everyone within the Jewish world says, yes, this counts as within the canon. After that, people debate who's in, who's out. Okay, so Babylonian Talmud, and there's 2 Talmuds. There's the Babylonian version, the Jerusalem version. They both comment on the same Mishnah, that same first layer, but their commentary is different. So this is a portion from the Babylonian Talmud in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which talks about the political systems and judicial systems of Jewish law. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, for what reason were the rationales of Torah commandments not revealed? So for the most part, not always, for the most part, when we read the commandments in the Bible itself, in the Torah, usually there's not a reason given for them. It just says, do this, don't do that. Sometimes there is a reason, but usually there's not. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, why is that the case? It was because the rationales of 2 verses were revealed, and the greatest in the world, King Solomon, failed in those matters. It's written with regards to a king, he shall not add many wives for himself, that his heart shall not turn away. His heart shall not turn away from God. Solomon said, I will add many, but I will not turn away, as he thought it permitted to have many wives, if one is otherwise meticulous not to stray. right? So the Bible has in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, there's a series of laws for what a king has to do and can't do. He has to write himself a book, a Sefer Torah, an actual Torah scroll. He's not allowed to accumulate many wives. He's not allowed to accumulate too much possessions. It's trying to keep the king in check, largely. And it explains that one of the reasons he shouldn't have too many wives is that his heart shouldn't stray from God. So King Solomon says, I can deal with that. I can have a lot of wives and still sort of keep my focus. And at the end of the day, he doesn't. And later it was written, for it came to pass Solomon was old, his wife turned away his heart after other gods. It's also written, he shall not accumulate many horses for himself, nor return the people to Egypt for the sake of accumulating horses. So, right, shouldn't accumulate too much wealth and shouldn't interact with Egypt because, Egypt is obviously a bad guy in our history. Solomon said, I will accumulate many, but I will not return. And it's written, a chariot came up and went out of Egypt for 600 shekels of silver. So he's sitting in, the ancient Near East as he's starting to build up his cavalry. Egypt is an obvious trading partner. Initially he said, I can build up my horses without trading with Egypt. And of course he ends up going into exactly what the purpose of the law said you shouldn't do. Teaching not only did Solomon violate the Torah, but he failed in applying the rationale given for its commandments. This demonstrates the wisdom in the Torah's usual silence as to the rationale for its mitzvot, as individuals will not mistakenly rely on their own wisdom to reason the mitzvot are inapplicable. Okay, so what's the basic understanding here? The Talmud is saying there are reasons for the commandments, and they function here at least rationally, right? You shouldn't have too many partners for the king and its wives. We shouldn't have too many partners because it'll turn your focus from what you should be focused on. You shouldn't start to engage in commerce with bad people and build wealth because you end up build wealth too much, especially as the king, so it takes you down a bad path. And so the reason for the rules are very simple, right? Like sort of normal political rules that make sense. And the Torah gives the reasons. And so a smart person, Solomon, who in our tradition is the smartest person of all time, basically says, well, I can manage this. I can achieve the goals without listening to the rules. So Talmud says, and that's why the Torah, for the most part, said, you know what, we're just not mentioning the reasons because people are arrogant. So if we go back to the example we gave with Kashrut, with Eliezer Berkovitz. So Berkovitz says one of the primary purposes of keeping kosher is to train yourself so that when you are engaging with your own material, physical needs, you learn to not only prioritize whatever I want now, but to listen to external rules. That trains us for when there's real moral quandaries where we have to sort of subjugate our own interests. It's very easy, right, to say, well, I can train myself to not just put my interest first no matter what, even if and still eat meat and milk. Like, it's not impossible to be a moral person and eat meat and milk, right? So slowly, if the Torah gave all of its reasons, we as humans would, in our arrogance, would sort of say, look, I can get to the goal without sort of all these extra rules. So I can put the rules to the side. And at the end of the day, the system then falls apart and the rules and the goals aren't necessarily achieved. That's the argument of the Talmud here. So what it tells us isn't don't look for the reasons, but kind of isn't that there aren't reasons, but don't focus on them. So when you focus on the reasons, you end up cheating. And the road will take you where it's supposed to take you. Focus on the road ahead, right? Don't let yourself focus on where you're trying to get and think you can take a shortcut. You can't. The road is just follow the path. It will get you to the right place. Now, whether you find that argument compelling or not, again, all of what we're doing over the course of these sessions is trying to show a wide variety of different positions within the world of Jewish thought. But this is one argument for saying ignore reasons for the commandments. Okay. Approach number 2 is the explanations themselves actually just not being particularly important. And this is a short portion, so this is from the Tur. The Tur, again, is part of using this also just for literacy in terms of our tradition. The Tur is one of the early codes, maybe the earliest Ashkenazi code of Jewish law. It's written in the late 1200s or early 1300s. The author of the Tur is the son of probably one of the most important Ashkenazi halachic commentators. His name is the Rosh Rabbeinu Asher, who has a gloss on the entire halachic gloss on the Talmud. And the Tur sets out basically sets out a code, sort of summarizing all of Jewish law that is applicable outside of a Messianic era. So it doesn't deal with like the temple, the Beit Mikdash, and sacrifices, but everything that's applicable outside of that. And his structure gets followed by the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is probably the most famous code of Jewish law, but the Tur is sort of the first Ashkenazi commentator that really sets out the structure, the basic structure of Jewish law. And he writes in talking about the rules around sideburns and shaving, there's rules around not using a straight blade to shave your face. That they'll find, there'll be people who, in order to observe that, will only use an electric razor. They won't use like an actual blade on their face, and not cutting your sideburns below a certain length, whatever, right? So there's texts around that in the Bible. In writing about that that mitzvah, or that commandment. The Torah writes, the rounding of the head and destruction of the beard. Even regarding these, Maimonides wrote that Scripture prohibited them because idol worshippers used to do so. So we talked about Maimonides the other day, hyper-rationalist. So Maimonides basically, for a lot of ritual commandments, said these were things idolaters used to do. In order to separate ourselves, we don't do them, period. However, this is not explicitly stated. I mean, the Torah doesn't say this. And we are not required to seek reasons for the commandments, for they are the decrees of the king upon us, even if we don't know their reasons. Basically, not making the argument of the Talmud. The Talmud's argument is, don't look at the reasons, it'll screw you up. You'll stop paying attention to what you're supposed to be paying attention to. You'll think you can shortcut. The Torah is just saying, I don't care. The religious life is doing the commandments that God commanded. Nice thought, Maimonides. It's not what the Torah says, I don't care. Right? And there is no argument here. The argument is the vision of religious life, and the vision of religious life is performing the commandments, period. That's the end of it. There's no need. This whole class, or this whole series of classes is really not what we're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be just following the tradition. That's the end. That's sort of a very sort of simple, simple argument. And now we're going to go into two more philosophical arguments as to why we shouldn't do philosophy, or more philosophical arguments as to why we really shouldn't look for reasons for the mitzvot. The first source, the first of these two is Yeshayahu Leibowitz. Yeshayahu Leibowitz was, if we ever had like a Jewish modern Renaissance man, it was him. He was a professor. He was a professor, I think, the head of the Department of Organic Chemistry at Hebrew University. He was educated in Europe before the war. I don't remember if he got to Israel. I don't remember if he was in Europe for the war or not. Educated at the University of Berlin, was a genius in terms of philosophy, had a huge following who gives sort of almost like cult following classes in Israel on the weekly Parsha, on Jewish philosophy, on Maimonides. Like I said, head of the Department of Organic Chemistry. He wrote about everything, and he also later in his life wrote more about Jewish politics and Zionism. Was very, very critical of a lot of things within politics, the state of Israel. But he had a very extreme approach to religion and to halakha, to Jewish practice. So this is actually the best source I could find to summarize. It wasn't a direct source from him, but from an online source called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It usually summarizes, it's not a Jewish source, it usually summarizes just secular philosophers, but had a very good long article on Yeshayahu Leibowitz. So Leibowitz distinguishes between two types of religious practice, lishma and not lishma. This dichotomy comes from much earlier. It's commonly discussed in the Talmud. Literally, what it means is lishma means for its name or for its own sake. Not lishma is not for its own sake. So you're doing something, for an ulterior motive or for its own sake. Lishma, doing it for its own sake, is always seen as better. The question is, what does it mean to do something lishma? So if we go back to our earlier classes, if the tradition has a goal, right? Let's say Maimonides' goal. The goal is true understanding of God. Putting on tefillin, right, or praying, lishma means doing it with the intent of trying to understand and contemplate the existence of God. You're doing it for the purpose that it's set out. Not, for example, to please someone in your family who wants you to do it, or to please some religious authority figure or someone at school. Right? It's doing it for its purpose. So whatever the purpose of Judaism is, that's what the lishma should be. That's the reason you're supposed to be doing it. So here's how Leibowitz distinguishes between lishma and not lishma. Worship that is not lishma, Leibowitz characterizes in teleological terms. Teleological means something that is targeted towards a specific goal. It begins with a set of human values and beliefs, and understands religion as the instrument for the realization of these values. Thus, religious acts will be derived from this set of values as the acts that best achieve them. So, if you think there's a human goal, making the world a better place, making any, enhancing morality, whatever you think is a good human goal, and you say, Judaism is great, it achieves that. You say, that's not lishma, that's taking your goal and implanting it and using Judaism to achieve whatever your human value is. These values, therefore, are prior to the religious act, much in the way utilitarian ethical theory prioritizes the religion of the good and defines right action in terms of what maximizes that good. So basically, it's a theory. We won't go into utilitarian ethics, but here utilitarian ethics basically says we want to maximize the good. Anything that maximizes the good is ethical. So too, he's saying if your view of religion is goal-oriented, you're defining your goal, whatever you happen to think, as one random person living in one snippet of time over history, what you have come to conclude that all of this is about, and then you're using all of religion and this whole tradition to achieve what you decide it should achieve. Again, I'm steel manning his argument, right? I'm trying to make it as strong as you can. Religious action then is at base motivated by human needs. And the problem with such worship for Leibowitz is that it renders God the servant of man. It is what he terms an endowing religion, a means of satisfying man's spiritual needs, assuaging his mental conflicts. Its end is man, and God offers his services to man, right? You are using God for whatever it is that your need is, right? So he takes this, by the way, to places that very logically flow from this, but that might sound extreme. So, for example, he heavily criticizes, there's a very, very common, almost universal tradition in Jewish synagogues where we say prayers for the sick. We just said at the beginning of this year is for for the merit of making someone better. He says that's illegitimate religiously. You're just trying to use God for whatever your needs are. Make someone who's sick healthy, whatever. He says that's okay. It's okay to want someone, or good to want someone to be healthy. It has nothing to do with religion. If you're just using God for your purpose. It's like it's like God is your doctor. So if you meet a doctor and they're helping you with something, everything they help you with might be incredibly moral, incredibly helpful. It's all good, but don't pretend that you're serving or doing anything good for the doctor. You're just using the doctor to help you, right? Which is okay, but it's not for the the doctor is a tool in your goal. In marked contrast to all of this, Leibowitz presents the idea of worship lishma, which is the mark of a demanding religion. Here, the religious act is prior to any set of human needs or values. It's characterized by acts of worship demanded by God, where the demands made and the motivations for serving are simply they are God's demands. The definition of what is the purpose of Judaism, or what is a Jewish religious act? Doing it because God asked you to do it. Period. That's it. If you're doing it for any other reason because it provides meaning in life, because you think you'll get some sort of afterlife or divine reward for it, because it's going to do any good effect, all of the other good reasons that we talked about for the first 2 weeks, if you're doing it for any of those, that's just using religion for your sake. Again, I want to emphasize, he is an extreme position, but it's a good counter voice, because I think there can be a tendency to take a tradition and say, how does this, in a positive way, say, how is this good for me? How is this meaningful to me? How does it relate to me? I think one of the powerful or compelling things in our religion is that there's these sort of foundational categories we call mitzvah, which is commandment, right? That's the sort of foundational category in Jewish action, and it flips the typical approach. The sort of fundamental starting question of Jewish religion isn't, hey, how is this meaningful to me? What does this mean to me? It's what's being asked of me. What is being commanded of me? Now, you might come to a different conclusion than Leibowitz. You might come to a conclusion that what's being asked of you is to make the world a better place, or it's being asked of you that what's being asked is something else. So he is extreme in saying the whole purpose is just the only legitimate way to act religiously is to do it because God said, end of story. But I think it's a very productive and important sort of counter voice to the attempt to sort of just use religion for whatever is important to us. There might be lots of things in life that are important to us and justified. There is a powerful or primary concept in the Jewish tradition that basically says, hey, there is something being asked of you. So step into it also with the voice of with the perspective of not what does this mean to me, but what's actually being demanded of me. Yeah.
Well, so if you're doing it because God said so, then the question becomes, why is God asking us to do these things?
So, so he says, basically, so I'm trying to think if I can remember how he would respond to that. Okay, so I think the way that he'd respond to that, and he probably has, and I'm not remembering, but is it might be interesting for you to know why, but the motivation, the ideal religious motivation is because they asked you. So, I don't know, and this isn't a perfect analogy, obviously, but take like a spouse, partner, friend, parent, right? Ask you to do something. You might want to know why they are asking you, but there is also a value in doing something that someone important to you is asking you because they asked you to do it, even if it doesn't make any sense to you or you think it's irrational. So whether he thinks we can know, I don't think he thinks we can know. I mean, he definitely doesn't think we can know. But in theory, even if you could know, it's saying the religious psychology or the religious motivation is do something good, do a religious commandment because God asked you. It's service of God. Again, this is an extreme articulation.
Kind
It doesn't seem that extreme to me, if I'm being honest.
Okay. All right. Yeah. How
Like-
come?
Man is hominids are inherently anthropocentric. Religion was invented for anthropocentric means of like, well, it shouldn't be viewed as bad necessarily, or maybe non-lishma, to want to know reasons for the commandments or what the Torah says, because religion was invented for trying to find a reason why this bright yellow circle rises in the morning and why a little white thing rises at other times and gets bigger and then gets smaller and then goes
Right.
away, and so you make a moon god and you make a sun god, and why is this wet stuff falling from the sky, and so you make a rain god, and so
Right.
you are trying to find reasons for why things that you don't have the scientific knowledge to know what they are, and then you assign a deity to it, and so this all seems linear and
Right.
like it tracks.
So what you're saying is, if I understand you correctly, is that this is consistent. This is consistent with a human created religion to ultimately deny, say, humans shouldn't be asking questions.
No,
Of the deity?
it's fully normal for humans to be asking questions and thinking about themselves
Right.
like that. That's
Right. No, that's right. That's normal. I'm saying what I think is extreme is trying to say we shouldn't have any. So it's not extreme in the Jewish tradition to say, even if you think you understand reasons, etc., all good, but you still in the end of the day have to do the commandment. That is sort of the standard traditional approach. Is that the commandment is obligatory, period, and we try to understand and know and whatever, and that will motivate. What he wants to do is take every single human need out. If you're praying for rain, that's an illegitimate prayer. And again, prayer for rain is like, there's a whole tractate of Talmud dedicated more or less to prayer for rain. So he has to reread a lot of the tradition. That's what I'm saying is extreme, because basically any time religion is being used in a helpful way, if we're asking God for something for us, that's a legitimate use of religion. And I think that's extreme. It's extreme just as far as the breadth of positions that exist. Like, it's most people within the Jewish tradition wouldn't say that. Like, almost nobody else would say that.
Some would even say that that's blasphemy, what
Yeah.
he says.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot. Yeah,
So he's almost saying that you don't need, then why pray to
because God said so.
Hashem told us that we need to pray?
That is the only in his position. That is the only reason to pray.
Right, but where does Hashem tell us to pray?
So
Because
that's a separate.
sacrifices,
The,
he doesn't really say to pray. We pray because we can't give sacrifices.
yeah, so he would respond. So prayer. This goes into a separate. The Talmud finds sources in the Torah for the obligation to pray. It's a debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides, between Rambam and Ramban, as to whether prayer is obligatory every day or obligatory only when the time demands it. But our tradition understands there to be that obligation. He would also say, and he does say, God commanded us to listen to the rabbis and the system they built. That starts to get complicated. What's the rabbi's motivation? But ultimately, the reason, he would say the only reason you're praying is because, and it is absurd, because our texts of our prayer are asking for things.
Right.
That's in the text. He basically says we say those prayers because God told us to listen to the rabbis, and the rabbis canonized that text. But it becomes a bit absurd. That's why it's extreme, because he almost ignores the actual request in the prayer.
a lot of those prayers are asking for stuff for people collectively, not like me.
That's equally
So
equally irreligious for him.
Okay.
It's not about selfish. It's actually not at all about selfishness. It's religion, and he separates. And maybe we'll keep reading. He sees ethics as very valuable. He's not anti or amoral. He just separates morality from religion. He says religion is do what God does because God says, and ethics is ethics. If they conflict, you have a challenge, and then your question is: are you more of a religious person or more of an ethical person? He can't tell you. It's almost a foundational. There is no argument as to why you should be one or the other. If you have a reason to be one or the other, say I'm going to be more religious because God will reward me, you're already not being religious, because the only reason to do the thing God said is because he said so. So it's almost like a foundational, just who are you? Are you the when they clash, are you the religious, are you the ethical? By the way, there's a famous there's a famous book called Fear and Trembling by a man named Soren Kierkegaard, who was a religious Christian philosopher in the late 19th century, one of the fathers of the existentialist movement. And he describes the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, where God demands Abraham, calls Abraham to sacrifice his son. He says that's what the binding of Isaac is the pitting of the ethical against the religious. And Abraham has to decide, because if you're willing to forego God to be religious, you have to be willing to listen to God at all costs, even when it contradicts the ethical. And that is the test.
Ethics come from the Torah, from the Tanakh?
Not in his perspective. So this is why this is.
Is his perspective coming from no religion?
No, he was an Orthodox Jew.
Okay.
And
Well,
I don't know why he got to this.
Like, okay, if you don't believe in God, you live ethically, you live morally, based on societal whatever. But where did societal norms come from? Came from the Torah.
So he would not. So he might say he would probably have to distinguish, and this is where there's a lot of challenges in this position.
Yeah.
He might say historically ethics might have evolved out of Jewish civilization and its text, and that's all nice and good and a nice historical, and maybe John Locke and democracy emerged from the influence of Judeo-Christian values or Judeo-value, whatever, all nice. That's ethics. It's all about humans. If you're acting because of those good, because it's good, that's ultimately even if we derive that from something from God, it's a human interest, which is nice, a good human interest, but it's human interest. Religious is doing something as God said so, period. So there are people, so for example, a counter position would be someone who would read, and I think actually David Hartman has, I can't remember the name of the book, but he has a book where basically he makes the argument that says his fundamental assumption is God is good. Now how he knows what's good and isn't good, I don't know, and God wants the good. So for him, if he finds a religious edict or a commandment that he thinks contradicts morality, he now has a problem. He says this is impossible. Now, does he either reconsider his morality or reconsider how to interpret the religious text? That might depend on a case-by-case basis, but he has two working assumptions, saying God is good and wants good, and morality is fundamental to what God wants, and I'm supposed to be listening to God. So, and when these two things seem to be contradicting, it's because I'm missing something. Whether I'm not reading the text right and I should have and God doesn't really want me to sacrifice Isaac, or I really am and it's moral, I don't know. We have to figure that out in each case, but you have to resolve it. Leibowitz is saying there's no resolution. There's ethics and there's religion. How you know what God said is a separate question. But let's say you know what God said. Let's say you know that God commanded you to pray. Then you pray not because you want anything, but because God told you to. So that's what here, if we keep going, the next paragraph, he says, Leibowitz's view of mitzvot has important implications for the relationship between ethics and religion in general, and more specifically for the relationship between ethics and halakha. Leibowitz does not deny that there's a genuine realm of ethical value, writing that both the theocentric, religious, and anthropocentric, so human-centered conceptions of value are legitimate, right? He's not saying ethics isn't legitimate. I think that's really important. God-focused life is legitimate. Human morality, world, eco, whatever focused life, whatever you think ethics is it sort of, if it's only humans, all of that is legitimate. But they're separate. Leibowitz recognizes that beyond the realm of halakha flourish many good deeds and events of grandeur and sublimity. Generally for Leibowitz, halakha is not all-encompassing, does not govern all behavior, as he makes explicit in his interviews, where he asks rhetorically whether Judaism has a perspective on the decision whether to build a bridge over a particular river. I think we are accustomed to thinking of Judaism as having something to say about everything. Having, what is the Jewish position on politics, on capitalism versus socialism, except we're accustomed to looking to Judaism to answer or to speak to everything. He is substantially narrowing the realm of religion, right? He's saying capitalism versus socialism is an important question. It's just not the question of do I do what God says when he asks me to do something. It's a separate important question. For Leibowitz, then, there are clearly other aspects of human life that are necessary, indeed valuable, and that need not be dedicated to the worship of God. If, therefore, one's acting for the sake of one's fellow man, if you're doing a good deed, one must simply recognize this is a performance of a noble ethical act, not a holy religious act. What Leibowitz stresses the importance of not confusing one for the other. So, again, I would say that this is not the common view. The common view is, I don't want to say the common view is because there's a wide range of views. The common view, though, is not to just say ethics is totally separate, has nothing to do with it, There are views that will say our ethics, all of our human-generated ethics are wrong, and we have to learn ethics from God. So God is always good, and this is moral. But if you think the Torah is immoral, it's because your ethics are wrong. There are views that say, no, you have to reinterpret the Torah. It came in a certain, even if it's all from God, it came in a context in time. We have to reread it because what we understand what ethics now is accurate. But most positions, wherever they fall in terms of, on that scale, will still try to make Judaism speak to and work with an ethical life and be motivating ethical action and have something to say about that. Most people who are consumed by religion, which most religious philosophers are, will broaden the scope of religion and say it speaks to everything or more and more things. It is not the common tendency for someone who is a religious philosopher to say, actually, religion deals with this little thing and everything else in life is also legitimate and it just has nothing to do with religion, right? So is skiing and having some sort of communion with nature in the mountains a religious act? For Leibowitz, of course not. God didn't ask you to do any of this. It might be a wonderful aesthetic experience, but it's not. Whereas for other people, no, that might be the pinnacle of their religious life, right? So he is. I think he's a valuable counter voice to the attempt to make. When you make everything religion, religion's left with nothing, right? If religion becomes like just your politics and your ethics and your everyday, and then you throw it could just become substitute for
dichotomy. Like, would he say a noble ethical act is only ethical but not in line with religion? Or would he say the noble ethic, since even though religion and ethics are separate-ish, they're interrelated enough that a noble ethical act can also be in line with what a religion might teach?
They can happen to coincide. It would literally be like, if two different people both asked you to go to the store and get the milk at the same time, then cool, go to the store, happen to satisfy two different relationships, but they have nothing to do with each other. So if God commanded you, don't kill, you're not doing that because of the harm that killing causes. You're not refraining from killing. When you're acting religiously, you're refraining from killing because God said so. If that happens to intersect with a religious act, then on the exterior you are doing both. You're fulfilling both obligations or both, but who you are as a person for him would come down to, or how you are acting comes down to what your motivation is. So if your motivation not to kill is because you think killing is really bad and it's going to cause a lot of damage, then not killing is not a religious act. Now, going back again to last week, for example, we talked about Yitzhak Greenberg and his perspective of the entire focus of the Jewish tradition is on enhancing the respect for, love of, appreciation for, etc., of life of humans, all life. Then not killing because you are respecting and sanctifying life is doing exactly what God wants you to do. That is a religious act, right? It's the opposite. That's like the pinnacle of the religious act. And for Leibowitz, that has nothing to do with religion. So again, this is an extreme. What we're looking at today are like examples of philosophies or positions that basically say religion, don't look for reasons at all, right? So the first one we looked at was don't look for reasons because it'll mess you up. Like there are reasons, but it's like if a kid asks 1,000 times, well, why this, why that, certain people say just do it, trust, this is the right thing, just trust me, right? That's kind of that approach. Like stop, you're going to screw this up by asking too many questions. Do what you're supposed to do. The second approach was sort of, I don't know where it was very simple. It was just simple. I don't say simple in a bad way, but sort of, this is what I was asked to do, so I do it. I'm not going too philosophical. Leibowitz is maybe then a much more worked out version of that second one of saying, no, we actually don't want to talk about reasons. As soon as you engage with reasons that are reasons other than God said so, you're actually just doing human stuff, which isn't religion anymore. If you're keeping kosher to help yourself be ethical, that's a very nice reason to keep kosher. It has nothing to do with religion. It's ethics, right? It's like someone who doesn't, if someone doesn't kill or doesn't steal, and you say, oh, you did a mitzvah. The person would say, no, I didn't do a mitzvah. I just did what's right, right? He would say this, so that's Leibowitz would say, yeah, the motivation is totally separate.
It would be really nice to see it inside because something about this seems really off. Like God created us as humans. Humans have brains. Humans have emotions. We're not robots. And so to say that you just got to do because God said so, and that's the ultimate goal, it seems like God messed up in creating us as humans now. I mean,
So maybe God secretly.
It's like we're robots.
There's a strong argument for that, actually.
maybe.
So I think it would be really good to see what he says inside in the text.
But so,
I don't
yeah.
know, because it seems like, I don't know, for me it seems like I'm totally not
Right.
getting it.
there's a lot of like this leads to like this is reflective. This definitely is reflective. Again, it's definitely better to read it inside. I'm sure there's more nuance, but this is, if you take me on my word, this is reflective of what he says in the articles. And there's a lot of issues. Like he reads, for example, he takes like the whole second paragraph of the Shema, right? It basically says like if you listen to God and do these things, good things will happen. If you don't, bad things will happen. He basically says that's not really true. We don't really mean that. It's like said to like sort of for people to feel good, but like that really has nothing to do with religion. He has to reread everything. Like it doesn't fit with our it doesn't fit with most of our texts. It doesn't. He would say. I think he would say we have no understanding of how creation works or why God created us. Like we just have nothing to say. Religion is just doing what God's. Like I think he would just end it there because we have no ability to understand God.
Could it be there's a balance where we should ask, we should try to understand, but at the end of the day, if we don't, we should still do it because God said so.
I think that is probably the more
ultimately,
common
that should be
approach.
The reason why you do it.
Right.
But you also want to try to make it personal and meaningful. But that shouldn't be the reason why you're doing it necessarily. Because if it's the reason, then you end up falling into traps like King Solomon, etc.
So I want to separate between two of the things you said. The first thing you said of like shouldn't we do it anyways, but also try to understand. I think that is like the most. I think that's
right there. Saying it like that, that's where you have the ethics side of things.
for Leibovitz, yeah. But I think if we go back and we step back from like we've sort of been immersed in this one approach, if we step out, that's the most common, I think, approach in our tradition.
He's not saying it's okay to question, but just don't make that the reason why you're doing it. Because if you make it the reason, then you have all these traps that you might fall into.
But then
That's
why
not
do you
what
say a prayer for healing the sick in shul? You don't say it because God told you to do that. So you'd say any religious act that's done for a lot of our religious acts are done for other reasons. You'd say like empirically they are, I think. But I think most people in our tradition would say, yeah, that's okay. Like our tradition conceives of God as compassionate. So asking for compassion is a normal thing to do within that framework. But I think the common approach is what you said in terms of we should try to understand the reasons. We should do it anyways, and I think the justification, argument for doing it anyways is humility. It's saying we don't necessarily understand, so if we think we figured it out, it's like the Solomon thing. We might not have totally understood the reason, or we might think we can circumvent the reason and we can't, but we should still be doing it. I think where it starts to get more complicated is if you really believe in the reason, like take Eliezer Berkovitz or it's Greenberg of Cultivating Life. I think your understanding of the reason, because even if you say do whatever God says, I think understanding what you think God says, even on the most orthodox framework, is pretty tricky. Like what does the halachic tradition tell you to do in specific scenarios? There's often a multiplicity of voices open for interpretation in many ways. What you think the goal is will very likely impact how you read that, right? If your like fundamental assumptions are God wants all life to flourish, cares about all human beings, including animals, etc., your read of certain, so let's be honest, in the Talmud there's all sorts of laws around our relationship to non-Jews that are extremely untrusting of non-Jews. Part of the motivation for that, perhaps, is that non-Jews didn't treat us particularly well in the past, so our interactions might have been quite negative. So there might have been very realistic perceptions in a context. If you say, well, this is what it says, so I'm doing it, then you say, well, I can't leave a non-Jew alone with certain people or animals because they will do all sorts of disgusting, evil things. Right? There are all sorts of laws like that. If you say, no, ultimately our goal of our tradition is cultivating respect, etc., for life, then in contexts where these were people who were untrustworthy and the non-Jews Jews were interacting with were actually quite evil to the Jews, then that was absolutely how we had to act. And as people have changed, we apply the same premise differently and act differently. So how you understand the purpose, how you understand like the purpose underneath, I think will impact how you interpret the law. Now, how someone like Leibovitz interprets, if he says it's just what God says, I don't know how he figures out what he thinks God says. Like, because I think we all interpret with the lens of who we think God is, even if we pretend not to. If we think God is good, if we think God likes Jews more than non-Jews, we'll interpret things a certain way. If we think God likes all humans the same, we'll interpret things another way. If we think God likes humans better than animals, we'll interpret certain laws around kashrut one way. If we think he likes all life the same, we'll interpret them a different way. So, like, I think what we think God really wants is a huge impact on how we actually interpret halacha and mitzvot. So for Leibovitz, it's actually, I think he leaves someone trying to interpret, like, okay, like I read all this text, how do I decide what God wants? I don't know. It's actually, I find it very impractical. Let's move on though to the fourth approach. So that's, again, I think what's fun about him is it's very interesting. It's a very interesting position. It's very, like I said, I think it can be a good counterweight in terms of, pushing back on positions that try to say Judaism is whatever I basically want it to be and whatever is useful to me, of saying no, like actually maybe try to actually have humility and say what is actually being asked or being said to me as opposed to what do I want it to say to me. But he takes it perhaps further than most of us would want. Okay, the last source we're going to look at is Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was a early 19th century, I want to say, although I think early 19th century. Hasidic rabbi. I think he's the great-grandson of the founder of Hasidut. The Hasidic movement emerges in Eastern Europe, largely in areas where of less educated Jews. There was a culture of elite Jewish learning as well in Eastern Europe, and the sort of more peasant, simple Jews who were not literate or not as literate and not as learned were perhaps left behind. They were sort of outside of the religious elite, who were the religious academics. This was a populist movement, and populism now maybe has a lot of bad connotations, but I think I'm saying that in a good way. It was a populist movement that sort of bringing religion back to the masses, saying you can relate to God through nature, through song, through all sorts. God is present in all sorts of other ways outside of just the text of the Talmud that most Jews then weren't able to access, both practically, educationally, in all sorts of ways. And so there was much more of at least in the origins of Chassidut, there was an admiration of and simplicity and of the ability to connect to God through simple human life, through material pleasures, through eating, through food, through song. Like I said, as it was an anti-elitist movement. So Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is perhaps one of the most prominent early Hasidic teachers. So this is sort of a short piece from him. So one must strengthen oneself in faith. Oh, and he was very anti-philosophers. He writes a lot sort of very critical of the sort of philosophical and ethical quest within the philosophical quest within Judaism, and trying to understand who God, all the types of questions that sort of you would in a forum like this we'd maybe want to talk about. He's often very critical of those. So he writes, one must strengthen oneself in faith and refrain entirely from engaging in inquiries or philosophical investigations, avoiding the study of books that delve into such matters. Instead, one should believe in the blessed God through simple faith, without any questioning or investigations at all. Even though it seems to us that the common folk are far removed from philosophical inquiries and are not engaged in them, the truth is that everyone to some degree is entangled in questions and doubts, right? So first point here that I think is really interesting or very observant is he says, right, everyone does this. This isn't something that just the people who are writing the sources we're reading do. Most people who are engaged with religion in any way have a lot of questions about it, right? And might be thinking about those questions. Those questions will lead them, is there a God? What is God? What does God want from me? There's a lot of questions that I think if you start to engage with religion, most people ask. Even children encounter thoughts of inquiry and confusion. Nevertheless, everyone must be extremely careful to distance questions and investigations from their hearts and completely cast them away, so as not to become, heaven forbid, a questioner at all. He says, we don't want to engage with these questions. Put them away. Instead, one should believe in God and the true righteous ones with simple faith, without any inquiries. For we have already merited receiving our holy Torah through Moses, our teacher, peace be upon him, and we have had many great and awesome righteous ones in every generation. It is proper for us to rely on them without any investigations and to follow their path, believing in the blessed God of simplicity, observing his Torah and commandments as passed down to us by our holy forebears. So the first argument he makes, to the extent he makes an argument, so I think the most powerful part and we'll see this here, and if we have a chance to look at other sources of his, most powerful part, in my opinion, is just his portrayal of a religious life that is of a simplicity in life. I think in a lot of ways, maybe culturally, there's been sort of a holding up of simplicity maybe as a value in other ways, of a simple life, a life that involves sort of, whether that's seen as a life that involves more manual labor and less purely intellectual, or whatever it is, but we have a culture of sort of admiring the beauty in certain modes of life of simplicity. He's arguing for that for religion, right? He says that is the most beautiful and the ideal religious life is the simple religious life of faith and of religious action. The first argument he gives for that is we have really good people to rely on. And I think if you want to, again, steelman this argument, it's like if I was to tell you that everything in this room is made of atoms, and you were to start thinking, well, I don't really know. Let me think about it. I want to try to figure it out. probably, I don't know, maybe someone here is a physicist, but like, I'm not going to get anywhere. Most of us are probably not going to get anywhere with that. We're going to say, like, look, there's people who really know what they're talking about. They've told us that, trust them. And, like, move on with your life and sit on the chair and don't be worried that atoms are going to separate. Just, like, relax and move on and accept this. This is scientific fact. I know nowadays what science and what isn't is also a cultural controversy, but each of us probably have our assumptions about what scientific fact is, and there's things that we just accept from the experts because it's a waste of our time to look into them. We have to just accept them and move on and live with them. He's saying that about religion, right? He's saying we have the experts have done it. You aren't going to figure this out, unless maybe you're one of the few. But you aren't going to figure this out. Move on, accept it, and live the beauty of that life. Don't look at the chair and say, can I sit on another particle that's going to separate every time you look at a chair? Because you'll have a miserable life if you do that, and you won't have a productive or functional life. Same thing he's saying with religion. So the goal is to really move those questions away. And then in truth, faith is a very strong and powerful matter. One's life becomes strengthened through faith. When a person has faith, even if suffering, heaven forbid, befalls him, he can console and uplift himself. Now again, this is arguments that Leibovitz would not like, saying faith is also actually has a utilitarian use, which is it helps to console you in life. It's actually having a simple faith is actually more useful for you in life, right? You'll feel better about things. And he says God will actually help you more. Knowing the blessed God will have mercy on him and improve his future. He can view suffering as beneficial and atoning, trusting God will bring him goodness, whether in this world or the next. However, a person of inquiry without faith, when faced with trouble, has no one to turn to, no means to sustain or console himself. An insightful person will understand these matters naturally and deduce one thing from another, for not everything can be explained in writing. In summary, the essence is simple faith without any investigations, and through this one will remain steadfast in this world and the next, never faltering. Fortunate is such a person. Again, I think this is probably for, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I think, for me at least, this is very counterintuitive. We tend to think of religion or certain things like maybe morality also. Certain categories in life we think of course, we have to decide for ourselves. We have to figure out for ourselves what is true and what is right and what is meaningful. And there's other categories like, are there atoms in this couch that we have defined as trust to the experts, and it's stupid and a waste of time to spend your energy on them. He's saying, why is religion not one of those things that we trust the greats? Now, again, I think there would be lots of arguments to counter. You could say, well, maybe because lots of smart people are on both sides of the religious question. We could start to say, again, you go into today's debates about science, about corona, whatever, there's lots of maybe smart people on both sides of all sorts of things, right? I don't want to get into those things, but the question of what type of experts are the ones, when do we take things on assumption and move forward, and when do we endlessly question, I think is a valuable one, because you can also live a life of endless religious question that then doesn't give you the satisfaction or the beauty of living within or without, right? He would maybe not say the beauty of without, but like there's a certain point at which the right thing is no longer to be focused on the question, but to live the beauty and simplicity of the thing itself and to stop questioning. And I think that's so as the fourth source bringing in, so he, unlike Leibovitz, he's not making this sort of crazy extreme argument of like it's not this like where you have to get yourself where you're never doing anything self-interested and you're always or even other interested or moral interest always just because God said, but it's another approach saying stop looking at all the reasons, just live it, right? Just live it and do it and stop asking all these questions. So that's, what time is it? Oh, perfect. We've got a few minutes left, but so if we did the first 3 weeks, we talked about all sorts of different arguments for goals and reasons, understanding what the tradition does and how it works, rational, mystical, individualistic, collective goals, like putting systems onto what this whole thing is about. Here are sort of four, maybe three, maybe I stretched it into four different approaches to saying stop all that, right? And just do the thing itself. One, stop all that because it's actually going to hurt you from achieving the goal, because you're going to, you think you understand it, then you're actually going to screw it up, right? It's the humility part. That was the one about King Solomon. One argument of saying religion is actually just doing it because God said so, everything else is not religion. And the third argument of saying that the beauty or the power of religious life lies in living the religious life and in stopping to constantly question each detail of it. That's it. Any?
Isn't he talking about questioning God himself, meaning faith, the existence of God, bigger questions like that, not necessarily reasons as part of it. What did it seem like he's writing about over here?
So I think you're probably right. I think that's more the focus. I think, and I've read a bit about him or a bunch, but not, I'm by no means an expert. I don't think the quest. Actually, I don't know. The truth is, I should back
once
off.
a person accepts God as a real existence, and they're not questioning, and hey, what about world is this old, but how could it be? And once
Right.
they accepted that God is the creator of the world and he runs the show, so then I think that's what he's referring to when he says as simple faith. Okay, now you can go ahead and do what you want to. You can do the mitzvah, but you could also ask, okay, hey, there's a God, so what's going on with this mitzvah?
I hear you. I think it's a good I think it's a good point. I think he's not saying don't ever ask the reason. I agree with you, but I do think the picture he paints from, again, in my exposure is I'm not an expert, but I do think both here and other places, I think the picture he paints is still the beauty of these religious life being focused on living within it simply. He talks a lot about like simplicity as in and of itself of value.
Right.
So it doesn't mean you can't ask or have like a reason or something meaningful, and I think he was a mystic, so my guess is that he probably does believe there's sort of cosmic impact of things going on in the heavens when you do things. But the mode of religious life that I think he holds up as the ideal, at least to others, maybe not to himself, is still focused on simplicity and doing it because not only because God said to do it and you can't ask reasons, but as a general way of religious life, that's where your energy is in living it simply, as opposed to the energy focused on understanding the reason and how it works. Like, it's not that constant intellectual focus on trying to figure it out. It's a focus on just being within it and living it simply. Does that?
Right here.
So I think you're right. Like, it doesn't deny the asking questions, but I think it shifts the focus as opposed to like rejecting it.
Right. It seems like he's more explicitly talking about the questions against the existence of God.
Yeah. So I think you're right. So
having simple faith that there is a God, there is a Torah, there are ways that we are supposed to do things, and it's good for us. And now do them and do them in whatever way you want that will enhance your life. Period.
Right. So I think I would separate. I think you're right. The part of when he's saying like when he's the anti-philosophical don't ask questions, I think is more focused on like, does God exist? Did God command, as opposed to what is the meaning of this commandment. I agree with you. I think the admiration of simplicity though goes beyond that and also says like in your religious life your focus is more on living it simply as opposed to figuring everything out. Yeah.
I would like to add one little thing. I'm not sure. It's a big myth. I also believe that Hasidut started for the illiterate and the people that were in the elite groups, right? That's like the common conception, but actually, supposedly that's a massive myth. And it was actually started to give people an enjoyment in their Judaism.
Right, to make it not sour.
To make it not sour, to make it not monotonous, to make it not just purely intellectual, to make it more emotional and enjoyable and meaningful.
What is that? Hasid?
That's
Just talking about Hasid.
Yeah, what the origins of Hasidut.
So is it the Hasidim